October 1944, Vosges Mountains, France. German commanders underestimated America's true power until they witnessed something impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Pence and 275 men of the 141st Infantry Regiment sat trapped behind enemy lines, 6 days without food, ammunition nearly gone. General Friedrich Wiese in Stuttgart studied his maps with confidence. These Americans would starve or surrender within hours. But something extraordinary was about to shatter every assumption the German High Command held about American fighting spirit. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed entirely of Japanese-American soldiers whose families sat imprisoned in American internment camps, received orders that would change everything. These men, dismissed by German intelligence as volunteers with no tradition, were about to prove that America's greatest weapon wasn't just its factories producing one bomber every 63 minutes. It was the unbreakable will of citizens, fighting for a country that had questioned their loyalty. What happened next defied every military calculation. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Damp pine needles crunched under worn boots. Fog wrapped the ridges near Bifontaine like a gray shroud, muffling the distant thunder of mortar blasts. The smell of cordite mixed with rotting leaves and the metallic taste of fear hung in the October air. Inside their shrinking perimeter, men of the 1st Battalion, 181st Infantry Regiment scraped frost from their helmets to melt for drinking water. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Pence moved between foxholes, his breath visible in the cold morning air. 6 days. 6 days since German forces had closed the trap around his battalion. The last supply drop had missed their position by 3 kilometers, falling instead into enemy hands. Now his men survived on fragments, a piece of cheese from a K ration, a handful of crackers, maybe a stick of gum if they were lucky. "Colonel, ammunition count is down to 12 rounds per rifle," Sergeant Martinez whispered, his voice hoarse from the cold. The sound of his words seemed to disappear into the thick forest, swallowed by towering pines that had witnessed countless battles over the centuries. Pence nodded grimly. 275 men trapped in a pocket barely 500 meters wide. German machine gun nests commanded every approach. Snipers picked off anyone who moved during daylight. The radio crackled with static. Headquarters seemed impossibly far away. Though they were only 30 miles behind what used to be friendly lines, Private Johnson huddled in his foxhole, staring at an empty K-ration tin. The label read, "Cheese American." He had scraped every molecule of food from inside, even licking the wax coating. His stomach cramped with hunger, but worse than the physical pain was the growing certainty that they had been forgotten. "Think they know where we are?" Johnson asked his foxhole mate, Private Williams, whose face had grown gaunt over the past week. Williams managed a weak smile. "They know? Question is whether they can reach us before we become skeletons." The sound of German artillery echoed from the next ridge. 88-millimeter guns by the sound, deadly accurate and powerful enough to shatter trees into splinters. But the shells weren't aimed at their position. The Germans were conserving ammunition, content to let hunger and cold do their work. A flare suddenly arced across the gray sky, burning bright red against the overcast. For 3 seconds, it illuminated the forest with harsh light, revealing the desperate faces of American soldiers pressed against earth and stone. Then darkness returned, and the flare fell unseen by those meant to find it. Cigarette smoke drifted across detailed maps spread under harsh electric lights. The basement headquarters in Stuttgart hummed with the quiet efficiency of the German General Staff, though the confidence of 1940 had given way to careful calculation by October 1944. General Friedrich Wiese leaned over the Vosges sector map, his weathered fingers tracing the mountain ridges where American forces struggled in the autumn cold. The 141st Infantry Regiment remains contained here. Colonel Hahn pointed to a small circle marked in red pencil. 6 days without resupply. Our estimates suggest they have perhaps 2 days of ammunition remaining, possibly less. Wiese studied the terrain carefully. The Vosges Mountains had always favored defenders, narrow valleys, dense forests, steep slopes that turned every advance into a bloody crawl. Even with American material superiority, geography remained on Germany's side. What of relief efforts? Minimal progress. American attacks have been repulsed with heavy casualties. Their 36th Infantry Division lacks the strength for sustained assault in this terrain. Hahn's voice carried the professional detachment of a staff officer, but beneath lay a thread of satisfaction. We estimate American tank losses at 15 vehicles per day attempting to break through our defensive positions. The general nodded approvingly. American commanders relied too heavily on mechanized warfare, he believed. In the mountains, courage and tactical skill mattered more than industrial production. German soldiers, hardened by years of combat, understood mountain warfare in ways that Americans never could. What intelligence do we have on relief forces? Wiese asked, accepting a cup of ersatz coffee from an aide. The bitter liquid barely resembled real coffee, but such luxuries had become memory in the fourth year of war. Limited. Some reports of Japanese-American units moving into the sector, but these appear to be support troops. Nothing significant. Colonel Hahn dismissed the possibility with a wave. Volunteers with no military tradition. Even if they reach combat positions, they lack the experience and cohesion necessary for effective assault. Wiese examined fuel allocation reports spread beside the tactical maps. 10 liters per tank per day. Barely enough for defensive positioning, certainly insufficient for major offensive operations. Yet German Panzer IV and Panther tanks remained formidable defensive weapons. Their thick armor and powerful 75mm guns capable of destroying American Sherman tanks at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Artillery ammunition status, the general inquired, though he suspected the answer would disappoint. Rationed to essential targets only. We estimate 3 shells per gun per day, maximum sustainable rate. The numbers told their own story. Germany's industrial capacity, hammered by Allied bombing, could no longer match the endless American supply chain stretching back across the Atlantic Ocean. Still, Wiese felt confident about the Vosges situation. Americans might have more equipment, but they lacked the patience for siege warfare. Hunger and casualties would force their withdrawal within days. He tapped his finger decisively on the map where the lost battalion lay trapped, certain that mathematics and geography had already decided their fate. Sparks showered across the concrete floor like metal rain. The rhythmic hammering of rivets created a thunderous percussion that drowned conversation across the mile-long factory floor at Willow Run, Michigan. Rosie Wilson wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her gloved hand, leaving a streak of oil across her brow as another B-24 Liberator fuselage panel slid down the assembly line toward final integration. The smell of hot metal, welding flux, and industrial oil filled the cavernous space. Overhead cranes moved with precision, lifting sections of aircraft that would soon carry war to German cities. The sound was overwhelming. A symphony of American production that operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without pause or mercy. 23 minutes ahead of schedule, shouted Mary Henderson over the noise, consulting the clipboard that tracked their section's output. Every rivet, every weld, every inspection was timed and measured with scientific precision. The goal seemed impossible when first announced, 1 complete B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Yet they were exceeding even that fantastic target. Rosie nodded, guiding another aluminum panel into position. Her husband was somewhere in the Pacific with the Navy, her brother with the Army in France. Every bomber that rolled off this line might provide air support for American soldiers, might bring the war closer to its end. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and repetitive, but it felt like the most important thing she had ever done. Railroad cars arrived constantly at loading docks, carrying raw aluminum from Western smelters, steel from Pittsburgh mills, instruments from electronics factories scattered across the industrial heartland. The logistics amazed even experienced engineers, hundreds of thousands of components flowing, together with clockwork precision, to create the most advanced bombers in the world. Germany's got maybe 12. Factories like this, plant supervisor. Tom Martinez explained to a group of government inspectors touring the facility. "We've got over 100. Plus, theirs are getting bombed every week while ours run at full capacity." The numbers spoke for themselves. By late 1944, American gross domestic product had reached $200 billion, nearly 4 times Germany's struggling economy. While German workers struggled with material shortages and bombing raids, American factories operated at unprecedented levels of efficiency and output. Outside, a completed B-24 taxied toward the runway for its maiden flight. The 4 Pratt & Whitney engines roared to life, each producing 1,200 horsepower. Within hours, this aircraft would join the growing fleet that was systematically destroying German industrial capacity and transportation networks. A railroad whistle echoed across the Michigan landscape as another freight train arrived with materials for tomorrow's production. The rhythm of American industry was relentless, unstoppable, a mechanical heartbeat that pumped weapons and equipment across oceans to every battlefield where democracy faced tyranny. As evening shift began, the factory lights continued burning bright against the autumn darkness. Inside, the hammering continued without pause, each rivet a promise that American soldiers would never lack for support, never face enemy forces with inferior equipment. The echo of Detroit's machines could be felt even in the distant Vosges Mountains. Mud splashed up from combat boots as soldiers of the 482nd Regimental Combat Team moved through the gray October morning. Their packs sagged under the weight of ammunition, medical supplies, and extra rations. Everything needed for what their officers warned would be a tough fight. The fog smelled of cordite and pine needles, with an underlying metallic taste that experienced soldiers recognized as the approach of serious combat. Major George Dewey stood before the assembled men of Company F, his breath visible in the cold air. Behind him, the Vosges Mountains rose like sleeping giants, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds. Somewhere in those ridges, American soldiers waited for rescue that might never come. "We've got orders to break through and save the 151st, he announced simply. The men of the 442nd had learned not to waste words on speeches. Their motto, "Go for broke," captured everything they needed to know about approaching battle. All or nothing. Complete commitment. Private Daniel Inouye checked his Browning automatic rifle one final time, running experienced fingers along the bolt mechanism. 6 months ago, his family had been behind barbed wire at an internment camp in California, labeled as potential enemies of the state they had served for generations. Now he carried America's most advanced infantry weapon into battle against fascism. "Think the Germans know we're coming?" asked Private James Okubo, adjusting the straps of his medical pack. As a company medic, he would follow the assault waves, treating wounded men under fire while enemy bullets searched for targets. Inouye managed a thin smile. "Doesn't matter what they know. Orders are orders." The 452nd Regimental Combat Team had already earned its reputation in Italy, where their casualties earned them the nickname Purple Heart Battalion. 14,000 Japanese Americans served in the unit, proving their loyalty with blood while their families remained imprisoned behind the wire of Executive Order 9066. Every Purple Heart, every Bronze Star, every Silver Star represented not just individual courage, but collective vindication of American citizenship. Sergeant Technical Grade Shiro Kashino studied the terrain ahead through binoculars. Dense pine forests, steep ridges, perfect defensive positions. German machine gun nests would command every approach. Snipers would pick off exposed soldiers. Artillery would rain down on advancing infantry with devastating accuracy. "Rough ground," he observed quietly to Lieutenant James Hanley, the company's ranking officer. Hanley nodded grimly. Intelligence reports indicated heavily fortified German positions manned by experienced mountain troops. The mathematics of assault warfare suggested terrible casualties for attackers attempting to dislodge determined defenders from prepared positions. The first artillery shells began falling in front of their position, ranging shots as German gunners searched for targets. Trees exploded into splinters. Shrapnel whistled through pine branches. The sound was deafening, but the men of the 442nd had heard it before in Italian mountains. "Go for broke," someone shouted as the barrage intensified. Others picked up the cry, their voices carrying across the mountainside despite the thunder of explosions. They moved forward into the storm of steel and fire, each step carrying them closer to their trapped countrymen. German soldiers crouched in their dugout, breaking black bread into thin slices with the precision of men who understood hunger. Outside, the wooden wheels of horse-drawn wagons creaked under loads of ammunition crates that contained perhaps one-tenth the shells American artillery would fire in response. The forest floor trembled with distant explosions, American guns ranging in preparation for another assault. Corporal Hans Müller examined his rifle with the careful attention of a man whose life depended on mechanical reliability. The Carabiner 98K remained an excellent weapon, accurate and dependable, but ammunition conservation had become critical. Battalion orders limited each rifleman to 20 rounds per day, unless under direct attack. "Count them again," ordered Sergeant Wilhelm Fischer, gesturing toward the small pile of artillery shells stacked against the dugout wall. Their entire position, a company-sized strong point, covering nearly 500 meters of front, possessed fewer than 40 shells for their two 75mm PAK anti-tank guns. Müller completed his inventory with growing unease. 37 shells remaining, Sergeant, plus maybe 200 rounds for the machine guns. Numbers that would have seemed adequate in Poland or France now appeared desperately insufficient against American abundance. The difference was staggering. Intelligence reports indicated that American forces fired more artillery shells in a single day than German factories could produce in a week. While the Wehrmacht relied on nearly 50,000 horses for transportation, American trucks delivered supplies with mechanical efficiency that seemed unlimited. "Listen," Fischer whispered, raising his hand for silence. The distant rumble was unmistakable. American vehicles moving along forest roads. Trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, all carrying ammunition and supplies that German forces could only dream of possessing. The sound continued for minutes, seemingly endless convoys feeding the American war machine. Private Ernst Hoffmann peered through a periscope toward American positions, counting muzzle flashes during the morning artillery barrage. "I estimate 20 guns minimum, Sergeant, maybe 30. Each of those guns would fire more rounds in an hour than his company would see in a month." The mathematics were crushing. American production delivered 89,000 tons of military supplies to Europe every day. German logistics, hammered by bombing and fuel shortages, struggled to move a fraction of that tonnage, while American soldiers carried multiple weapons, rifles, pistols, grenades, automatic weapons. German troops hoarded every bullet. "Any word on ammunition resupply?" Müller asked, though he expected no encouraging answer. Fischer shook his head grimly. "Supply convoy was hit by American aircraft yesterday. Lost everything." The sergeant's voice carried the exhaustion of a professional soldier who understood that courage alone could not overcome material disadvantage. Measured in thousands of tons per day, American artillery began its afternoon bombardment, shells screaming overhead like freight trains. The volume was overwhelming, hundreds of rounds falling across German positions in preparation for infantry assault. Trees shattered under high explosive impacts. Earth fountained skyward. The very ground seemed to shake with each detonation. "We cannot match this storm," Fischer whispered, as shells continued falling like steel rain. Every explosion represented American industrial capacity that German factories, bombed and starved of raw materials, could never hope to equal. Tree trunks splintered under machine gun fire that sounded like industrial saws cutting through lumber. Smoke burned in the throat and nostrils, thick with the smell of cordite, shattered pine, and something else that experienced soldiers preferred not to identify. Shrapnel cut through bark like invisible knives, sending wooden fragments spinning through the air with lethal velocity. The first assault waves of the 442nd had moved forward at dawn, disappearing into fog that clung to the mountainside like gray cotton. Now, 3 hours later, the sound of battle echoed through valleys and ridges, rifle fire punctuated by the deeper bark of automatic weapons and the thunder of artillery. Medic James, Okubo crawled forward through underbrush torn by bullets, his Red Cross armband clearly visible against the autumn camouflage. Ahead, he could hear someone calling for help in the rapid, clipped phrases that meant serious wounds. The voice was young, scared, but trying to maintain discipline even while bleeding. "Over here!" "Medic!" Private Inuya's voice carried above the rifle fire. He had taken shrapnel in the leg during the initial assault on a German machine gun position. Blood soaked through his field dressing, but he continued directing fire for his squad, while lying behind a fallen pine log. Okubo reached him under covering fire from other squad members. The wound was serious, but not immediately life-threatening. Metal fragments had torn muscle, but missed major arteries. Working quickly, the medic applied pressure bandages and morphine while bullets whispered overhead. "How many more?" Inuyi asked through gritted teeth, referring to casualties from their company's assault. "Too many," Okubo replied honestly. The terrain favored defenders completely. German positions were carefully sited to create interlocking fields of fire. Every advance required crossing open ground, swept by machine guns. Artillery support helped, but couldn't eliminate well-constructed bunkers carved into solid rock. Stretcher bearers moved past, carrying poncho-covered shapes back toward aid stations. The mathematics of assault warfare were brutal. Attacking forces typically suffered casualties at rates 3 to 5 times higher than defenders. Against prepared positions in mountain terrain, those ratios could reach 10 to 1 or worse. Sergeant Kashino appeared through the smoke, his face grim. "Third platoon is pinned down about 200 meters ahead. Can't advance. Can't retreat." His rifle was caked with mud and pine needles, but remained functional. Experienced soldiers learned to maintain their weapons under the worst conditions. The sound of American artillery intensified as fire support officers called in strikes against German positions. Shells screamed overhead before exploding among pine trees, sending showers of wooden splinters and metal fragments down on defenders. Yet the German machine guns continued firing with disciplined precision. "Advance by squads," Kashino ordered. "Keep low, use cover, don't bunch up." Standard infantry tactics, but difficult to execute under fire that seemed to come from every direction. The Nisei soldiers moved forward with determination born of desperation. Their trapped countrymen depended on breakthrough that must come regardless of cost. Night began falling across the battlefield, bringing new challenges. Visibility dropped to meters. Sounds became crucial for navigation and survival. Stretcher bearers continued their grim work, carrying wounded men back through mud and darkness while the battle raged on without pause. Detroit's skyline glowed orange against the October night, factory furnaces burning bright while across the Atlantic. The Vosges Mountains remained cloaked in wartime blackout. The contrast illuminated everything about why Germany was losing the war. American cities blazed with production light, while German factories struggled under constant bombing and material shortages. At River Rouge Steel, the third shift arrived precisely at midnight, workers streaming through gates that never closed. Blast furnaces operated continuously, converting iron ore from Minnesota's Mesabi Range into steel that would become tanks, artillery, ships, and aircraft. The volume was staggering. American steel production exceeded the entire Axis, combined by margins that seemed impossible. Shift supervisor Frank Romano checked production schedules posted near the main entrance. Tonight's quota: 800 tons of armor plate for Sherman tank production, plus 600 tons of high-grade steel for aircraft manufacturing. Numbers that would have seemed fantasy in 1940 had become routine by 1944. Germany's burning furniture to keep their factories running, Romano explained to a group of new workers arriving from Kentucky coal country. "We're running 3 shifts, 7 days a week, with enough raw materials stockpiled for 6 months of continuous operation." The mathematics of industrial warfare had become decisive. American factories produced 2.4 million trucks during the war, more vehicles than Germany's entire automotive industry had manufactured in its history. 634,000 Jeeps rolled off assembly lines, While German forces increasingly relied on horse-drawn transport that moved at medieval speeds, aircraft production told the same story with even more dramatic numbers. American factories completed over 300,000 aircraft of all types, while German production struggled to reach 40,000 despite desperate efforts to increase output. Every day, the gap widened as bombing raids disrupted German manufacturing while American production accelerated. Radio operator Betty Morrison monitored communications between factories across the industrial heartland. Steel from Pittsburgh, aluminum from Western smelters, rubber from synthetic plants in the South, all flowing together with precision that amazed even experienced logistics experts. Railroad cars moved in continuous streams, carrying raw materials and finished goods with clockwork efficiency. Telling and preparing the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Convoy loading for European theater, announced Dock Supervisor Mike Sullivan over the plant loudspeaker. Outside, trains assembled the daily shipment of military supplies bound for Atlantic ports. Tomorrow, these materials would begin the journey to French battlefields, where American soldiers needed every advantage industrial capacity could provide. The scale defied comprehension. American war production consumed raw materials at rates that exceeded most nations' total economic output. Copper, aluminum, steel, rubber, chemicals, resources flowed into American factories in quantities that enabled unlimited equipment, replacement, and continuous technological improvement. German intelligence officers studying American production. Reports initially dismissed the numbers as propaganda. No nation could possibly manufacture 2,400 heavy bombers per month while simultaneously producing thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and ships. Yet reconnaissance flights over American cities confirmed the impossible: factory complexes that stretched for miles, operating at capacity that exceeded German theoretical calculations. A completed M4 Sherman tank rolled off the production line every 30 minutes. German panzer factories, despite heroic efforts, required weeks to complete single vehicles. For every German shell fired, American artillery answered with 3. The industrial imbalance had become so extreme that courage and tactical skill could no longer compensate for material disadvantage. Whistles cut through morning fog like metal screams, signaling the final assault that would decide everything. Men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team surged forward through pine trees and underbrush, shouting "Banzai!" as German shells exploded overhead with thunderous detonations that shook the mountain itself. This was the moment when mathematics and logistics would be decided by courage and determination. Private Daniel Inouye moved forward despite the shrapnel wound in his leg, his Browning automatic rifle chattering as he fired at muzzle flashes, visible through smoke and morning mist. German machine gun positions had been sighted with professional skill, interlocking fields of fire that turned every advance into a bloody crawl across ground swept by bullets. "Keep moving! Don't stop!" Sergeant Kashino's voice carried above the rifle fire and grenade explosions. The veteran NCO understood that momentum was everything in assault operations. Hesitation meant death. Retreat meant failure. The only path lay forward through steel and fire toward objectives that must be taken regardless of cost. Artillery support had done its work, shattering German positions with high explosive shells that splintered trees and sent earth fountaining skyward. Yet determined defenders survived in bunkers carved from solid rock, their weapons still functional and deadly. Machine gun fire swept the slope like invisible scythes, cutting down attackers who exposed themselves for even seconds. Company F had started the assault with 180 men. After 4 hours of fighting, perhaps 90 remained effective. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Breakthrough required accepting casualties that peacetime minds could not comprehend. Every yard gained cost blood, but the alternative was abandoning trapped countrymen to starvation and capture. German resistance began cracking under sustained pressure. Ammunition ran low in defensive positions. Communications failed as radio sets were destroyed by artillery. Officers fell to sniper fire, leaving junior NCOs to coordinate defense with fragmentary information and dwindling resources. 3rd Squad, take that machine gun nest. Lieutenant Hanley pointed toward a German position that dominated the ridgeline. Private Inouye and 3 other soldiers moved forward under covering fire, grenades ready for close assault. The advance was methodical, professional, deadly. German soldiers fought with desperate courage, knowing that retreat meant abandoning the entire defensive line. Veterans of Russia and North Africa, they understood infantry combat with lethal expertise. Yet numbers and firepower gradually told their story, American abundance in ammunition and artillery. Support created advantages that individual skill could not overcome. Bangalore. Torpedoes exploded through barbed wire obstacles, clearing paths for advancing infantry. Flamethrowers scorched bunker positions with liquid fire that penetrated every crack and crevice. Bazooka teams destroyed machine gun nests with shaped charge warheads that turned concrete and steel into flying fragments. By afternoon, German lines had shattered completely. Surviving defenders slipped away through forest trails, abandoning positions they had held for weeks. The ridge belonged to the 442nd, purchased with blood and courage that would be remembered as long as America honored its heroes. Silence descended across the battlefield like a blessing. Smoke drifted through shattered pine trees. Medics moved among the wounded with practiced efficiency. Stretcher bearers began the grim work of casualty evacuation. The price had been paid, 800 casualties to rescue 211 survivors. Mathematics that seemed insane, except to those who understood that some things mattered more than numbers. Gaunt, unshaven faces emerged from foxholes like ghosts materializing from earth and shadow. The lost battalion, what remained of 275 men after 6 days of isolation, blinked in disbelief as soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team appeared through smoke and morning fog. Relief had come at last, carried by men whose own families sat imprisoned behind barbed wire in distant camps. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Pence struggled to his feet, his uniform hanging loose after days without adequate food. Around him, soldiers who had survived on melted snow and hope tried to comprehend that their ordeal was ending. The sound of approaching footsteps seemed impossible after so many days of listening only to enemy fire and their own rapid heartbeats. "You made it," Pence whispered, as Major George Dewey approached through the devastated forest. Pine trees stood like broken teeth, their tops sheared off by artillery. The ground was torn by shell craters and littered with equipment scattered during the fighting. "We didn't think anyone was coming," Dewey saluted formally, then extended his hand. "Never doubted it for a minute, sir." "Americans don't abandon Americans." His words carried weight earned through 6 months of combat in Italian mountains, where the 442nd had proven their dedication with casualties that earned them recognition as the Purple Heart Battalion. Private Johnson emerged from his foxhole, clutching the empty K-ration tin that had become his most prized possession. 6 days of scraping frost and melted snow had left him hollow-eyed and weak, but alive. Around him, other survivors moved like men walking from nightmares into daylight. "Got any food?" asked Private Williams, his voice hoarse from dehydration and cold. The question sparked nervous laughter from both units, exhausted men finding humor in their shared desperation. Private Inouye, his leg wound freshly bandaged, reached into his pack and pulled out a piece of hardtack bread. Standard field ration, hard as stone and nearly tasteless, but precious as gold under current circumstances. Without hesitation, he broke it into pieces and began sharing with men he had never seen before today. "Here," he said simply, offering half to Johnson. "We're all Americans." The gesture rippled through both units as Nisei. Soldiers shared their remaining rations with rescued men who accepted food gratefully from hands they had been taught to view with suspicion. Executive Order 9066 seemed impossibly distant from this mountain ridge where courage transcended every artificial barrier constructed by fear and prejudice. Sergeant Martinez sat beside Sergeant Cascino, comparing notes about their shared ordeal. 6 days, Martinez said. Thought we were finished when the artillery stopped yesterday, Kashino nodded grimly. We lost a lot of good men getting here. 800 casualties to reach you. The numbers hung in the air like smoke, terrible arithmetic that reduced human sacrifice to statistical abstractions. 800, Pence repeated softly. Mathematics that made his own survival seem almost criminal by comparison. 211 rescued at the cost of 800 wounded or killed. Yet every man present understood that the calculation had been necessary, even inevitable. As evening approached, American artillery had shifted to support positions, maintaining defensive fires that discouraged German counterattacks. Medical teams worked to evacuate wounded men from both units, treating injuries with morphine and bandages that seemed luxurious after days of improvised care. A crust of bread passed from hand to hand, shared among men who would remember this moment when peace returned and normal life resumed. In the gathering darkness, differences of race and background mattered less than the simple fact of survival, proof that America's strength came not from any single group, but from the combined will of all its people. Allied commanders leaned over maps, spread beneath bright electric lights, their penciled arrows tracing the collapse of German defensive positions throughout the Vosges Mountains. The successful rescue of the lost battalion had created strategic opportunities that rippled far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Red markers showed German units in retreat. Blue arrows indicated advancing Allied forces pushing toward objectives that had seemed impossible just days earlier. General Jacob Devers studied the tactical situation with professional satisfaction. The 6th Army Group had achieved breakthrough that opened pathways into Alsace and beyond. German 19th Army, already weakened by months of attrition, could no longer maintain coherent defensive lines across terrain that had previously seemed impregnable. Vosges secured, announced Colonel James Patterson, intelligence officer for the 7th Army. German resistance collapsing across the entire front. Estimates show enemy forces retreating toward the Rhine at rates exceeding 10 kilometers per day. The numbers represented strategic success, measured in geography and time. Every kilometer gained shortened. The war by precious days. The breakthrough had severed German communications between Army Group G and Army Group Upper Rhine, creating gaps in defensive coordination that American forces exploited with mechanical precision. Truck convoys rolled through mountain passes previously dominated by German artillery, carrying supplies and reinforcements toward objectives that included Strasbourg and the Rhine crossings. Supply statistics told their own story of American advantage. While German forces retreated on foot or in horse-drawn vehicles, American divisions advanced with full mechanized support. Fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, replacement equipment, everything flowed forward in quantities that enabled sustained offensive operations without pause for resupply. Railroad reconstruction proceeding ahead of schedule, reported transportation. Corps Liaison Major Robert Hayes. Expect rail supply? Capability within 72 hours. American engineering? Efficiency had become legendary among Allied forces, bridges rebuilt, roads repaired. Rail lines restored with speed that amazed European observers accustomed to slower reconstruction timetables. Intelligence reports from captured German documents revealed the enemy's desperate situation. Fuel rationing had reached critical levels. Artillery ammunition was limited to emergency defensive fires only. Vehicle maintenance suffered from parts shortages that left entire battalions immobilized. Despite mechanical problems that American units would consider routine, the strategic implications extended beyond immediate tactical gains. German forces withdrawing from the Vosges could not establish new defensive positions without time and materials they no longer possessed. Each retreat uncovered flanks of neighboring units, creating cascading effects that accelerated Allied advances across broad frontages. French forces of the interior, encouraged by visible German weakness, increased sabotage operations against remaining enemy supply lines. Railroad bridges, communication centers, fuel depots, all became targets for resistance groups that sensed final victory approaching. Psychological warfare had become as important as physical destruction. Weather reports showed approaching winter conditions that would favor forces with superior logistics and equipment. American soldiers carried adequate clothing, food, medical supplies, and ammunition for sustained operations in mountain terrain. German troops, stripped of resupply capability, faced the prospect of fighting while inadequately equipped for alpine warfare. The map told the story with crystalline clarity. Blue arrows pushed eastward toward the Rhine, while red markers indicated enemy forces in full retreat. What had begun as tactical rescue operation had become strategic breakthrough that opened pathways to German heartland. The mathematics of warfare, industrial capacity translated into battlefield advantage, had achieved decisive results that no amount of individual courage could overcome. Allied planners began drafting orders for exploitation operations that would carry American forces to objectives previously considered beyond immediate reach. The tide had turned irreversibly. Momentum gained through sacrifice and determination that would reshape the entire strategic situation. Bomb bay doors opened over German cities like mechanical flowers, blooming with steel petals, releasing streams of high-explosive ordnance that fell like deadly rain on factories, railroad yards, and military installations below. The statistical scale of destruction reflected American industrial capacity that had become the decisive weapon of the Second World War, manufacturing death and devastation in quantities that overwhelmed German defensive capabilities. By November 1944, American steel production exceeded the entire Axis, combined by margins that staggered military analysts on both sides of the Atlantic. Monthly output reached levels that German planners had considered theoretically impossible. Raw tonnage that translated directly into tanks, artillery, ships, aircraft, and ammunition, produced at rates that enabled simultaneous global warfare across multiple theaters. Production statistics read like science fiction to German intelligence officers who struggled to comprehend numbers that challenged every assumption about industrial capacity. 300,000 aircraft built since Pearl Harbor, 2.4 million trucks rolling off assembly lines, 634,000 Jeeps manufactured for military service, 86,000 tanks produced in factories that operated 24 hours per day without interruption. The bombing campaign against German industry had achieved results beyond the most optimistic Allied projections. Synthetic fuel production dropped to 20% of 1943 levels. Aircraft manufacturing fell to 25% of peak output. Railroad locomotive production virtually ceased as machine tools were destroyed faster than replacement capability could restore them. Impossible numbers, muttered Oberst Heinrich Weber, studying captured American production reports in his Berlin office. German economists had calculated that no nation could simultaneously produce such quantities of military equipment while maintaining civilian economy and agricultural production sufficient to feed 140 million people, yet reconnaissance flights over American cities confirmed the unthinkable. Factory complexes that stretched beyond horizons, railroad yards filled with more rolling stock than Germany possessed in total, ports crowded with ships being loaded at rates that exceeded German theoretical maximum capacity by factors of 10 or more. Chemical warfare had taken new forms as American industry produced explosives in quantities that permitted unlimited artillery bombardment. German gunners rationed shells, while American batteries fired preparation barrages that consumed more ammunition in single days than Wehrmacht monthly allocations. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers learned to expect overwhelming firepower preceded every American. Assault raw material availability told the story of global industrial networks that German autarky policies could never match. American aluminum production drew ore from Jamaica, Brazil, and domestic sources. Copper came from Chile, Peru, and Montana mines. Oil flowed from Texas, California, and Middle Eastern fields controlled by Allied forces. The scale of resource mobilization dwarfed anything previously achieved in human history. German submarine warfare, initially successful in disrupting Atlantic supply lines, had been overwhelmed by American shipbuilding that replaced losses faster than U-boats could sink vessels. Liberty ships rolled down launching ways at intervals measured in days rather than months. By 1944, merchant tonnage available for military supply exceeded German estimates of total American requirements by comfortable margins. They are building more ships than we can sink, more planes than we can shoot down, more tanks than we can destroy, reported Admiral Karl Dönitz to Hitler during a staff meeting in November 1944. The mathematics of industrial warfare had rendered traditional military calculations obsolete. For every German shell fired, American artillery replied with 3. For every German aircraft lost, American factories produced 5 replacements. The industrial imbalance had created a military situation where courage and tactical skill could no longer compensate for material disadvantage measured in millions of tons annually. The highest numbers spoke for themselves. With finality that no propaganda could disguise, America had weaponized democracy itself, transforming civilian industrial capacity into military production that overwhelmed totalitarian systems based on forced labor and conquered resources. Washington, D.C., spring 1946. Sunlight streamed through tall windows of the White House East Room as President Harry Truman stood before rows of Nisei veterans in dress uniform, their ribbons and decorations telling stories of courage that had rewritten American military history. The ceremony represented more than recognition of individual heroism. It marked fundamental transformation in how America understood citizenship, loyalty, and sacrifice. These men fought for democracy while their families lived behind barbed wire, Truman announced to assembled dignitaries, reporters, and military officials. They proved that American citizenship is not determined by ancestry, but by devotion to the principles that make us free. His words carried weight earned. Through political battles that had taken months to arrange this recognition ceremony, to Daniel Inouye stood at attention as the President approached with the Medal of Honor, America's highest decoration for valor in combat. The citation read like poetry written in blood, actions taken during the final assault that rescued the lost battalion, decisions made under fire that placed duty above personal survival, leadership that inspired others to achieve impossible objectives. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Truman read the formal language that reduced human courage to official phraseology. Yet the words carried meaning beyond their literal content, recognition that heroism transcended every artificial barrier constructed by prejudice and fear. Behind Inouye stood other recipients of decorations that chronicled the 482nd's record of sacrifice: 21 Medals of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 9,500 Purple Hearts, statistics that made the 442nd Regimental Combat Team the most decorated unit of its size in American military history, achievements purchased with blood and determination. The mathematical cost had been staggering, 314% casualties over 2 years of combat operations. Entire companies destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Replacement soldiers arriving weekly to fill ranks depleted by combat that showed no mercy for courage or good intentions. Yet the unit had never failed to accomplish assigned missions, never retreated without orders, never abandoned wounded comrades, regardless of tactical situation. General Mark Clark observed the ceremony from the front row, remembering desperate hours when the 442nd had saved his Fifth Army from potential disaster in Italian mountains. Their assault on Gothic-line positions had achieved breakthrough that military analysts had considered impossible, shattering German defenses through application of courage that mathematics could not measure. 800 casualties. To rescue 2 out of 11 men, whispered retired Lieutenant Colonel Charles Pence to his wife as they watched from gallery seats. The arithmetic still seemed insane after months of reflection. Yet he understood that some calculations transcended mere numbers. Human dignity demanded rescue attempts regardless of cost ratios that accountants might question. The ceremony concluded with presentation of unit citations that recognize collective achievements beyond individual heroism. Presidential Unit Citation for Actions in France. Regimental Combat Team Commendation for Service in Italy. recognition that came slowly but carried weight of official acknowledgment that courage had proven American ideals stronger than wartime hysteria. As veterans filed from the East Room, their families, no longer imprisoned behind barbed wire, waited in corridors and reception areas. Children who had grown up in internment camps now saw their fathers honored as heroes. The transformation was complete, visible proof that democracy could correct its own failures through application of principles that transcended temporary fears. Pine needles in distant Vosges forests had long since returned to earth, but their legacy endured in recognition ceremonies that proved America's greatest strength lay not in industrial capacity or technological superiority, but in the combined will of all its people united by shared commitment to freedom that could not be destroyed by prejudice or conquered by force. The medals gleamed in afternoon sunlight, physical symbols of spiritual victory that had required 4 years of war to achieve. America had discovered its true arsenal, not steel and bombs alone, but the unbreakable determination of citizens who understood that liberty required eternal vigilance and occasional sacrifice beyond measure. You enjoyed the story. I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.